The buzzards circled overhead like harbingers of death, and their shadows dancing across Eliza Carraway's swollen face as mirages of water shimmered just beyond her reach. In her delirium, she could taste the cool sweetness of the Arkansas River, where she'd grown up, could hear her mother's voice calling her for supper. But when she opened her cracked lips to answer, only the desert wind replied with its mocking whisper. 3 days without water had reduced her world to a single burning obsession. The blindfold her attackers had tied around her eyes was crusted with dried tears and sand, while the rope binding her wrists had rubbed her skin raw. Every breath felt like swallowing fire, and her tongue had swollen until it barely fit in her mouth. The heat was a living thing that pressed against her, like a suffocating blanket turning the air itself into an enemy. Her dress, once white cotton, suitable for travel, had become a shroud stained with dust and desperation. The rocks beneath her had grown so hot they burned through the fabric, adding fresh torment to her already overwhelming misery. Through the haze of approaching death, she heard hoofbeats real or imagined, she could no longer tell. The sound grew closer, accompanied by the soft jingle of silver ornaments and the whisper of moccasins on stone. A shadow fell across her burned face, blessed and cool. "Please." She croaked the word barely human, her voice reduced to the whisper of wind through dried bones. Calloused fingers touched her chin, tilting her head upward with surprising gentleness. Cool leather pressed against her lips, followed by water so pure it tasted like salvation itself. She drank desperately, each swallow a miracle that brought her back from the brink of madness. A knife whispered through hemp, freeing her hands with surgical precision. Strong arms lifted her onto horseback as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. And a voice spoke words that would change the trajectory of her entire existence. "Hold fast. We ride before the desert claims another soul." As they galloped from Dead Horse Basin, Eliza pressed her face against her rescuer's broad back and wondered if she'd traded one form of dying for another. In the lawless Colorado territory of 1875, a woman's fate often rested in hands far crueler than the desert's merciless embrace. The man who'd saved her was Comanche, though she learned this gradually as they rode through the afternoon heat. His name was Quanah, and he moved through the hostile landscape like it was his own parlor, following trails invisible to white eyes, but clear as highways to someone raised on the endless plains. He was 32 years old, with weathered features that spoke of countless seasons spent under open sky. His hair was streaked with premature silver and worn in 2 braids decorated with eagle feathers and bits of turquoise that caught the light like captured stars. Across his chest, he wore a breastplate made of bone tubes and leather, while his moccasins bore intricate beadwork that told stories of battles fought and honors earned. As they rode, the oppressive heat of midday gradually gave way to the softer warmth of late afternoon. The landscape around them was harsh, but possessed its own terrible beauty, towering red rock formations carved by wind, and time scattered with hardy desert plants that had learned to survive where other life perished. In the distance, purple mountains rose against a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon whole. "You speak of men who left you in the basin," Quanah said as they paused beside a trickling spring where cottonwoods offered blessed shade. "Did they say where they planned to travel?" As Quanah filled his water pouch, Eliza watched him sprinkle a few drops on the ground before drinking. The gesture was so natural, so unconsciously reverent, that it spoke of generations of wisdom passed down through ceremony and daily practice. "Why do you do that?" she asked, genuinely curious about this man who combined a warrior's deadly skills with such quiet reverence for the world around them. "Mother Earth gives us water. We return a little to show we remember the gift." The explanation was simple matter of fact, but it carried more meaning than a dozen speeches about respect and gratitude. Eliza found herself studying his face as he spoke, noting the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for signs of danger, while his hands moved with unconscious efficiency in caring for their needs. There was something about him, that reminded her of her father. The same quiet competence, the same way of moving through the world as if he belonged wherever he chose to be. North, she managed, her voice still raw from thirst. One mentioned Copper Junction, meeting someone there about business they had pending. Quanah's expression darkened like storm clouds gathering over distant mountains. His entire posture shifted subtly, becoming more alert, more predatory. That town harbors many men who would shoot a Comanche on sight. What draws you to such a dangerous place? She told him then about her parents' murder 6 months earlier. The stolen deed, months of hiding her condition, while Cain's reach seemed to extend everywhere she tried to seek refuge. She described the head injury that had cost her most of her sight, the growing certainty that she'd never find justice in a world that seemed designed to protect men like Cain while grinding down their victims. As she spoke, fragmented memories began surfacing like debris from a shipwreck, hazy recollections from childhood of a man who'd visited their ranch occasionally during her early years. Her father had called him Eli Brooker, treating him with the respect due to a business associate who claimed to represent Eastern mining interests seeking investment opportunities in the developing territory. I remember one evening when I was maybe 8 or 9 years old. She said, the memory growing clearer as she voiced it aloud. I was supposed to be asleep, but I'd crept downstairs for a drink of water and heard voices in my father's study. This Brooker had been drinking whiskey with my father, and he'd started bragging about his business investments and holdings. She paused, allowing the memory to crystallize completely before continuing. He was telling my father about his philosophy of never getting trapped in any situation. Said every business he owned had what he called escape routes for men with foresight. He specifically mentioned that even in places like saloons and gambling houses, he always insisted on hidden passages behind the fireplaces, quick exits for high-stakes games that might need to end suddenly if the law showed up or debts came due. Quanah listened without interruption, but she could see him filing away every detail with the careful attention of a man who understood that such information might mean the difference between life and death. Men who plan escape routes are men who expect to need them. No, at the time I thought it was just grown-up talk, the kind of boasting men do when they've had too much whiskey. Eliza continued. But now I realize he was describing a network of safe houses and bolt holes throughout the territory. He wasn't just a visiting businessman, he was already planning to take what belonged to others. The pieces were beginning to fit together in ways that made her stomach churn with dread and growing anger. Her family hadn't been killed in a spontaneous act of greed, they'd been murdered as part of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that stretched back to her childhood, planned by a man her father had trusted and welcomed into their home. This Cain who killed your parents. Quanah continued, his voice carrying the flat certainty of experience. I've seen his kind before. They don't build anything, they just take what others have worked for. And they always have hunting dogs to do the dirty work while keeping their own hands clean. Understanding passed between them, two people, bound by loss and the hunger for justice from men who dealt only in violence and greed. As darkness fell over the desert, bringing blessed relief from the day's heat, they made camp in a narrow canyon where Quanah built a fire that gave no betraying smoke. Among my people, he said, as they shared dried meat and parched corn, when someone saves another's life, their spirits become connected. He paused, considering his words carefully. What happens to you now affects me as well. That sounds like a heavy burden to carry. Eliza replied, though she found the idea strangely comforting after months of facing danger alone. All worthwhile things carry weight. He studied her face in the firelight, noting the determination that had carried her through months of hardship. You've carried your own burdens without breaking. That speaks to strength most people never discover they possess. As the fire died down to glowing embers, Eliza found herself listening to the night sounds of the desert coyotes calling in the distance, or the rustle of small creatures hunting or being hunted, and the eternal whisper of wind through stone. For the first time since her parents' death, she felt something approaching peace. "Tell me about your brother," she said softly, wanting to know more about this man who'd saved her life at considerable risk to his own. Quanah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying flames. When he spoke, his voice carried the rhythm of a man telling a story he'd repeated many times, keeping memory alive through the power of words. Tachi was 5 years younger than me, born in the spring when buffalo returned to the plains after the long winter. He had a gift with horses that seemed like magic to those who didn't understand the patience and wisdom it required. The warrior's voice took on warmth that softened his weathered features. He could gentle the most stubborn stallion through understanding rather than force reading the animal's spirit and finding ways to communicate that went beyond words or signals. Quanah pulled a small carved figure from his medicine bag, no bigger than his thumb, made from polished wood, with details so fine they seemed to capture the essence of living movement. Our grandmother made this when he was born, said it would guide his soul to the spirit world when his time came. The carved horse was beautiful in its simplicity, worn smooth by years of handling. Eliza could feel the love and hope it represented, the connection between brothers that transcended death itself. "That's why you're hunting Kane's gang," she realized with sudden clarity. "Not just for stolen property, but for your brother's soul. In our way, a man's spirit cannot rest while his most prized possession remains in enemy hands." Quanah carefully returned the carving to his bag. Tachi wanders the Badlands, waiting for his war pony to be returned or his death properly avenged. Dawn brought the sound that would test them both, the dry whisper of scales across stone. A diamondback rattlesnake lay coiled near Eliza's bedroll, its wedge-shaped head weaving hypnotically as it prepared to strike. She froze, knowing any movement would trigger an attack that would kill her as surely as the desert thirst had nearly claimed her. The serpent was massive, thick as her wrist, and longer than her arm, its diamond-patterned scales gleaming in the morning light. Heat-sensing pits had locked onto her warm flesh, and she could almost feel death coiling to spring with mathematical precision. Quanah's knife took the serpent cleanly behind the head, pinning it to rocky ground, where it thrashed briefly before going still. But the brief commotion had attracted attention from above. 3 riders sat their horses on the canyon rim, studying the scene below with predatory interest. "Fresh tracks down here," one called down with satisfaction. "Horse and 2 people on foot, just like the boss described them. Could be our runaways from the basin," another replied, leaning forward in his saddle. "Kane's offering good money for that caraway woman, dead or alive." The 3rd rider studied the canyon's layout with professional assessment. "Boss says she might be carrying something valuable, papers or documents that could cause problems if they reach the wrong people. Wants her taken alive if possible, but dead will do if that's how circumstances play out." Eliza's blood turned to ice water in her veins. They weren't just hunting her randomly. Someone had given them specific instructions about her potential value alive versus dead, which meant the conspiracy was larger and more organized than she dared imagine. Quanah painted his face with mud and pulled his hat low, transforming himself into just another frontier drifter. When he called up to the riders in broken English, his Comanche heritage disappeared beneath carefully crafted misdirection that spoke of years spent surviving in a world that would kill him for what he was. "You fellows seen game this morning? Been tracking deer since yesterday. Trails gone colder than a banker's heart in winter." The lead rider studied him suspiciously, noting the horse, the camping gear, the general appearance of a man trying to make his living in difficult country. "You're mighty far from anywhere civilized, friend. Most folks with sense avoid this country like they would smallpox. Trapping season just starting." Quanah replied with a careless shrug that suggested he was accustomed to taking risks for potential profit. Prime pelts bring good money in Dodge City, and a man's got to make his living somehow. You boys wouldn't know anything about a woman and her rescuer in these parts. Heard tell there might be reward money involved. The riders exchanged meaningful glances that confirmed they were indeed hunting for something specific, not just patrolling randomly through dangerous territory. Could be truth in that rumor, their leader said eventually. You find them, you bring them to Virgil Kane in Copper Junction. He'll make it worth your while, guaranteed. Much obliged for the information. Quanah replied with apparent gratitude. I'll keep my eyes open for anything unusual. After the riders departed, convinced they'd spoken to a harmless opportunist who might actually prove useful, Quanah waited a full hour before emerging from hiding. When he did, his expression was grim as winter stone. Professional hunters. He observed gathering their supplies with urgent efficiency. They know this country, know how to track, know how to kill. This canyon becomes a tomb if we stay here much longer. They rode hard through increasingly treacherous terrain, following deer paths that wound between towering rock spires sculpted by millennia of wind and weather. The landscape provided natural concealment, but also countless places for ambushes, and both remained constantly alert for signs of pursuit. The heat built steadily as morning progressed, but it was a different kind of heat than the killing furnace of Dead Horse Basin. Here, canyon walls provided intermittent shade, while occasional springs and scattered vegetation suggested that life could survive for those clever enough to find the hidden resources. By midday, dust clouds on their back trail confirmed their worst fears, multiple riders moving with coordinated precision and gaining ground despite their head start. Kane had mobilized every gun for hire in the territory, and the net was tightening around them with professional thoroughness. There, Quanah pointed toward an abandoned mining camp tucked into a narrow valley between two mesa formations. We rest there, plan our next move. The camp was a graveyard of broken dreams, rusted equipment scattered like mechanical bones, buildings sagging under years of neglect, and the harsh weather of high desert country. Wooden sluice boxes lay shattered among creek stones, while a stamp mill stood silent as a tombstone, marking the death of someone's hopes for easy wealth. Silver mine, Hastaust. Quanah explained as they led his horse into what had once been a bunkhouse for optimistic miners. White men dig holes everywhere, looking for metal and stone. When they don't find enough to justify the expense and effort, they abandon everything and move on to new prospects. The building smelled of old tobacco smoke, stale sweat, and the particular despair that comes from dreams deferred too long. Names and initials carved into the wooden walls told stories of men who'd hoped to strike it rich and gone home poorer than when they'd arrived, their savings spent on equipment and supplies that now rusted in the desert sun. In the largest structure, Eliza's searching hands found something that made her heart race with sudden hope. A leather pouch hidden beneath loose floorboards containing what felt like official documents, with raised seals and formal handwriting that suggested legal importance. Mining permits. Quanah said, examining the papers by lamplight as evening shadows lengthened around them. Federal grants signed by your father Thomas Caraway 6 months before his death. The implications struck her like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. Even if Kane has stolen our surface deed, he cannot legally mine the silver without your permission. These documents prove you inherited mineral rights independently of surface ownership. Quanah's tone carried new respect and understanding of what she represented. More importantly, they provide evidence that Kane and his partners committed federal crimes punishable by hanging. Eliza studied the papers with her limited vision, making out official seals and formal signatures that spoke of government authority at the highest levels. The documents were complex, filled with legal terminology that would have been incomprehensible to most frontier settlers, but the essential message was clear. Her father had been far more careful and forward-thinking than she'd realized. But why would my father file these separately from our ranch deed? She asked. Because he suspected trouble was coming from men he'd learned not to trust completely. Smart men protect their most valuable assets through multiple legal channels. Quanah carefully folded the documents and returned them to their protective pouch. Your father knew about threats to your property, knew others would try to steal what rightfully belonged to your family. These papers were his insurance policy. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, growing louder and more organized with each passing moment. Through cracks in the building's weathered walls, they could see torches moving through the valley, like malevolent fireflies surrounding the abandoned camp, with methodical thoroughness that spoke of professional planning. Kane had returned with reinforcements, at least 8 men, possibly more, moving with the coordination of experienced hunters who'd done this kind of work before. The mine shaft, Quanah said, pointing toward a boarded entrance half hidden by scrub brush and accumulated debris from years of wind and weather. It leads through the mountain. If the tunnel hasn't collapsed from neglect, and if it has, then we die underground instead of under open sky. His matter-of-fact acceptance of the risk was somehow more reassuring than false optimism would have been. But at least our bodies won't provide entertainment for buzzards and coyotes. They pried away rotting boards to reveal absolute darkness, a throat of stone that seemed to swallow light itself. The air flowing out carried the smell of damp earth rust and something else that might have been the exhalation of deep places, where sunlight never reached and strange things grew in eternal shadow. Behind them, shouts erupted as Kane's men discovered their escape route and began coordinating their pursuit. They're in the mine block, the other entrance, if there is one. But it was too late for that strategy to be effective. Quanah led his horse into the tunnel, while Eliza followed close behind, one hand on his shoulder and the other trailing along the rough stone wall for guidance. Their single torch flickered like a dying heartbeat, casting dancing shadows that made every step treacherous and uncertain. The tunnel was a nightmare of narrow passages and groaning timber supports that creaked ominously under the mountain's immense weight. Water dripped from unseen heights, while their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, sometimes seeming loud as thunder, and sometimes absorbed by stone, as if they'd never existed. Behind them, voices grew louder and more organized as Kane's men entered the mine shaft in determined pursuit. The sound carried strangely in the tunnels, sometimes seeming close enough to touch, sometimes fading to whispers that might have been imagination or the mountain itself breathing around them. This way, someone shouted with authority that suggested military or law enforcement experience. Fresh tracks in the dirt still moving. Split up at the junction, another voice commanded with equal confidence. They can't have gotten far in this maze, and there's only so many ways out. The tunnel branched repeatedly, and each time Quanah had to stop and test air currents to determine which passage led toward the surface, rather than deeper into the mountain's heart. Some choices dead-ended in worked-out ore pockets, while others descended into flooded chambers that would have drowned them both if they'd made the wrong decision. Time became meaningless in the absolute darkness that pressed against their eyes like a physical weight. They might have been walking for minutes or hours, and there was no way to tell without sun or stars to mark their progress through the underground labyrinth. Their torch guttered lower with each passing moment, threatening to leave them in blackness so complete it would be like being buried alive. In the absolute blackness of one particularly narrow section, Eliza's enhanced hearing proved invaluable in ways that surprised them both. "Stop," she whispered urgently to Quanah, her hand gripping his arm. "I hear water dripping heavily ahead this way. Leads to a flooded chamber. But the air current is coming from our left, carrying the scent of sage and pine." Her damaged vision had forced her to develop other senses to a remarkable degree. And in the mine's darkness, she could navigate by sound and smell, with greater precision than someone dependent primarily on sight. The months of adaptation that had seemed like nothing but loss and limitation were revealing themselves as unexpected advantages in circumstances she could never have anticipated. Following her guidance, They found the correct passage just as their torch finally died, leaving them in absolute darkness. But fresh air touched their faces, carrying the scent of pine and sage that meant salvation lay somewhere ahead. Quanah's horse whickered softly, sensing the outdoors with animal instincts that had evolved over millions of years of survival. When Eliza stumbled over loose stones and cried out involuntarily, the sound rang through the tunnels like a dinner bell, announcing their location to every pursuer in the mountain. Immediately, their enemies' voices grew excited and more focused, echoing through passages that amplified and distorted sound in confusing ways. North Passage. They're in the North Passage. Converge on Grid 7, block all secondary exits we can find. Footsteps pounded through darkness, growing closer with each heartbeat. Multiple voices echoed and re-echoed, until it seemed like an entire army was pursuing them through the mountain's bowels. Quanah swept Eliza into his arms and ran, navigating by memory and instinct through passages that might collapse at any moment under the stress of their desperate flight. They burst from the tunnel onto a hillside overlooking Copper Junction's scattered lights, with Kane's men still echoing through the mountain behind them, like voices from the underworld itself. The mining town sprawled across the valley like a fever dream of ambition and greed, lanterns twinkling in windows while forge fires glowed red from smelting operations that worked around the clock to extract wealth from the surrounding mountains. "We beat them." Eliza gasped, testing her twisted ankle gingerly while trying to catch her breath. For now. But Kane knows we're heading to town, and he has allies there who'll be watching every street and building. Quanah helped her onto his horse. His movements urgent despite their temporary safety. "We must move quickly, strike before they can organize proper defenses and turn the entire town against us." Copper Junction at night was a study in contrasts that spoke of a community caught between civilization and frontier chaos. Raucous laughter spilled from saloon doorways, competing with the steady thunder of stamp mills crushing ore in the surrounding hills. Even after midnight, the streets bustled with miners, changing shifts, gamblers seeking fortune at card tables, and women in bright dresses walking wooden sidewalks worn smooth by countless boots. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke cooking food horse manure and the metallic tang of processed ore. Lanterns cast pools of yellow light that created as many shadows as they dispelled, while the constant noise of human activity provided cover for anyone who needed to move unseen through the maze of buildings and alleyways. The mining claims office occupied a modest building squeezed between a general store and a gun shop, its professional appearance suggesting honest business in a town where honesty was often for sale to the highest bidder. Light showed beneath the door, despite the late hour, indicating someone was working inside with the dedication of a man who took his responsibilities seriously. Quanah knocked 3 times soft raps that wouldn't attract attention from passers-by, but would be heard clearly by anyone inside who was listening for visitors. The door opened to reveal a young man in his 20s, with sandy hair and ink-stained fingers that marked him as a clerk or accountant accustomed to working with documents and figures. He looked nervous, glancing past them to scan the street with the wariness of someone who lived in a place where danger could emerge from any shadow. After a moment's evaluation, he ushered them inside, quickly closing and bolting the door behind them, with movements that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd provided sanctuary to people in need. "We're not officially open," he said, though not unkindly. His voice carried the careful modulation of someone who'd learned to keep his thoughts private in a place where the wrong words could prove fatal. "If you're looking to file new claims, come back after 8 o'clock when the territorial representative arrives. We're not here about filing new claims," Eliza said, producing the leather pouch from inside her dress with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and nervous tension. "We need help authenticating some documents we found." The young man studied her face in the lamplight, noting the signs of hardship and desperation that marked someone who'd been running from serious trouble. After a moment's consideration, he seemed to reach a decision that went beyond mere professional courtesy. "My name is Deputy Sheriff Sean Rourke," he said, lighting additional lamps to brighten the office. "I'm not the main sheriff, but I work part-time in this office because I know more about mining law than most attorneys who come through these parts." He was perhaps 25, with intelligent green eyes and the earnest expression of someone who still believed justice was possible, despite working in a place where justice was often auctioned to the highest bidder. There was something in his manner that suggested he'd seen enough corruption to recognize it when it appeared, but not so much that he'd given up fighting against it. "My real job is keeping the peace in a town that attracts every kind of trouble imaginable," he continued while arranging his desk to examine documents properly. "But territorial authorities pay me to verify mining claims and resolve disputes because I understand the law better than most folks who just want to dig holes and hope for the best." When Eliza handed him the leather pouch, Rourke's reaction was immediate and telling. As he spread the documents across his desk under bright lamplight, his expression shifted from mild curiosity to stunned amazement that suggested he'd never seen anything quite like what lay before him. Jesus Christ. He breathed, examining official seals with a magnifying glass and comparing signatures against reference materials he pulled from a secure filing cabinet. "These are original federal mining permits signed by the territorial governor himself. And this," he held up a comprehensive document covered with formal signatures and multiple wax seals. "This is a mineral rights grant covering 3,000 acres along the Arkansas River, legally filed and properly registered with territorial authorities in Denver." Rourke looked up at Eliza with sharp attention that made her feel like she was being evaluated for some test whose parameters she didn't understand. "The name on these papers is Thomas Carraway. Any relation?" "He was my father." "Your father. Then your—" Understanding dawned in his eyes, like sunrise over distant mountains, bringing with it implications that changed everything about their situation. "You're Eliza Carraway, Thomas Carraway's daughter who supposedly died of fever with the rest of your family 6 months ago. You knew him by reputation, and I met him once when I was a boy visiting relatives near your ranch. My family had a small spread about 15 miles downstream from your property before we lost it to a bad winter and even worse luck with cattle prices." Rourke's expression hardened with old anger and remembered pain that spoke of injustices he'd never forgotten. "Your father was known throughout the territory as an honest man who kept his word and treated everyone fairly regardless of their station or circumstances. The official report said fever killed my parents and destroyed our ranch. That never made sense to anyone who knew Thomas Carraway personally. He was too careful, too knowledgeable about frontier medicine and proper sanitation to let fever take his family." Rourke's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that suggested he'd been thinking about this inconsistency for months. But murder for valuable land, that would make perfect sense, especially if someone wanted their property badly enough to kill for it and had the connections necessary to falsify official reports. No, Virgil Kane murdered them on orders from someone here in Copper Junction. Someone with enough influence to falsify official reports and cover up the crime afterward. The deputy was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the lamplight, as if weighing her words against everything he knew about human nature and frontier justice. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd been investigating corruption for months without finding enough evidence to act decisively. "Your father filed these mining rights 6 months before he died," he said finally, his tone carrying new respect for a man who'd shown remarkable foresight. "Right around the time rumors started circulating about major silver deposits along the Arkansas River, deposits rich enough to make their owner one of the wealthiest individuals in Colorado territory. But Kane stole our surface deed when he murdered my parents. He stole ranch property rights, yes. But these are federal mineral rights filed separately with territorial authorities in the capital." Rourke tapped the papers with his fingertip, his excitement growing as he explained the legal implications. If these documents are genuine, and they certainly appear to be authentic, then you own extraction rights to your family's land, regardless of who might hold the surface deed. The implications staggered Eliza like a physical blow that left her breathless and reeling. For months, she'd assumed that Kane's theft of their ranch deed had left her with nothing but memories and a hunger for revenge. To discover that her father had protected their most valuable asset through separate legal channels was almost too much to comprehend. Meaning what exactly? Meaning that whoever forged documents to claim your ranch committed federal crimes punishable by hanging. More importantly, they can't legally extract a single ounce of silver without your written permission. Rourke's voice grew urgent with excitement and the possibility of finally striking back against the corruption he'd been fighting. This could be evidence enough to destroy Kane and whoever hired him to commit murder. Quanah had been listening silently, but now he leaned forward with intensity that made the lamp flames flicker from the movement of air around them. The woman is in immediate danger. Kane and his men are here in town tonight, and they've convinced your sheriff that she's some kind of dangerous criminal who needs to be brought in dead or alive. Rourke's expression grew troubled and angry, the look of a man who'd suspected corruption but hadn't been able to prove it until now. Sheriff Hutchins isn't exactly what you'd call incorruptible. If Kane offered him enough money to look the other way and file false reports. He shook his head grimly. But these papers change everything. If I can get them to federal authorities in Denver, there's no time for that. Eliza interrupted. Kane knows I'm here. He'll try to kill me before dawn, and he'll destroy any evidence that threatens his operation or exposes his partners. Then we force a confrontation on our terms in a place where there are witnesses he can't silence or intimidate. Rourke stood up his mind, clearly racing through possibilities and contingencies that might give them an advantage. The Copper King Saloon is the biggest establishment in town, always full of miners and merchants who matter in territorial politics. If we can get Kane, they'll get him talking in front of people who have influence. That sounds like an excellent way to get ourselves killed in a very public manner. Quanah observed with characteristic understatement. Maybe so. But it's better than waiting for him to hunt us down like animals in the street, or burn us out of whatever building we try to hide in. Rourke began gathering the documents, carefully handling them like the precious evidence they represented. Besides, I know the owner of the Copper King. He's an honest man who owes me favors, and he's got no love for Kane's type of business. As they prepared to leave the claims office, Eliza felt a mixture of hope and terror that left her stomach churning like a storm-tossed sea. After months of running and hiding, she was about to confront her parents' killer in his own territory, surrounded by his allies and supporters. But now she had proof of his crimes and allies willing to risk their lives for justice. One more thing you need to know, Rourke said, as they stepped into the street where pre-dawn darkness was beginning to give way to gray twilight. Kane isn't working alone in this conspiracy. He's got a partner, someone with enough money and influence to corrupt local law enforcement, forge federal documents, and make inconvenient people disappear permanently. Who? Elias Broder. He owns the largest silver mine in the territory, has contracts with railroad companies planning to build through this region, and employs half the men in this town through direct wages or business relationships. Rourke's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been investigating corruption for months, gathering evidence piece by piece. If Kane is the gun in this operation, Broder is the hand that aims it? And if we're going to get real justice for your parents, we need to expose them both. As they walked toward the Copper King Saloon through streets already busy with morning commerce, Eliza realized her quest for justice had become something much larger than personal vengeance. This was about a conspiracy that reached into territorial government, involving men wealthy enough to buy judges and sheriffs like merchandise at a general store. But she also understood that she was no longer fighting alone. She had allies now, people who believed her story and were willing to stake their lives on seeing justice done. It would have to be enough, because retreat was no longer an option that could satisfy her need for closure and peace. Behind them, unnoticed in the growing crowd of early risers heading to work in mines and mills, men in dust-covered clothes watched their movements with predatory interest. Kane had indeed returned to Copper Junction during the night, and he'd brought reinforcements who knew the town's geography better than any outsiders possibly could. The trap was closing from multiple directions, but the question remained, who would prove to be the hunter and who the prey? The Copper King's saloon lived up to Deputy Rourke's description, a sprawling establishment that occupied most of a city block, with multiple gaming rooms, a restaurant serving decent food at reasonable prices, and a stage where traveling performers entertained audiences of miners, merchants, and cowboys passing through Colorado Territory's most prosperous mining district. The building itself was impressive by frontier standards, constructed of solid timber and brick, with a false front that made it appear even larger than its already substantial size. Through the windows, warm light spilled onto the wooden sidewalk, accompanied by the sounds of masculine conversation, clinking glasses, and the steady rhythm of cards being shuffled and dealt at gaming tables that never closed. At mid-morning, the place was already busy with the kind of men who made fortunes by thinking faster and taking bigger risks than their competitors. These were not the desperate prospectors who worked individual claims with nothing but hope and determination, but successful mine owners, equipment suppliers, and investors who understood that real wealth came from controlling the infrastructure that supported the mining industry. Card games occupied most of the tables, while others bellied up to the long mahogany bar imported at great expense from San Francisco. Their conversations focused on ore prices, railroad construction schedules, and territorial politics that would determine who prospered and who failed in the coming years. A piano player hammered out popular tunes that competed with the general din of masculine conversation about money power and the endless opportunities available to men bold enough to seize them. Rourke led them to a corner table where they could observe the room's multiple entrances, while remaining relatively inconspicuous among the crowd. The position also allowed them to hear conversations at nearby tables, potentially gathering intelligence about the loyalties and relationships that would determine how the coming confrontation played out. Quanah had abandoned any pretense of disguising his Comanche heritage in a place like the Copper King. Exotic was just another form of entertainment that nobody questioned too closely, as long as it didn't interfere with business or threaten their personal safety. Broder usually comes in around 10 o'clock. Rourke explained as they ordered coffee and breakfast to blend in with other patrons. He likes playing high-stakes poker with fellow mine owners and railroad investors, and he always travels with bodyguards who double as business associates. What about Kane? If he's in town, he'll show up eventually. Men like Kane can't resist the opportunity to drink and gamble with other people's money, especially when they think they're safe from consequences. Rourke's expression grew grim as he scanned the room for familiar faces. But we need to be prepared for the possibility that this whole thing is a trap. Kane's too smart to walk into an obvious ambush without having prepared countermeasures. As if summoned by their conversation, Virgil Kane pushed through the saloon's main entrance, followed by 4 of his men who moved with the coordinated precision of professional killers accustomed to working as a team. The room's energy shifted subtly as other patrons noted their arrival conversations becoming more guarded and eyes watching more carefully. In the lamplight filtering through windows, grimy with coal smoke, Eliza could see Kane clearly for the first time since that nightmare morning at her family's ranch. He was older and more weathered than she remembered, with new scars that spoke of violence and hard living accumulated over months of frontier lawlessness. A knife scar ran along his left cheek, while his hands showed the calluses and nicks of a man who'd learned to survive through the skilled application of violence. But his pale eyes retained the same predatory coldness that had haunted her dreams. And his smile was still the expression of a man who enjoyed causing pain and suffering. When he surveyed the room, His gaze lingered on faces with a calculating assessment of someone evaluating threats and opportunities. Kane's men positioned themselves strategically around the room, taking seats at the bar and scattered tables where they could watch entrances and control access routes. These weren't ordinary cowboys or drifters, but professional gunmen who'd learned their trade through years of dangerous work in a territory where violence was often the final arbiter of disputes. "There he is." Eliza whispered, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. The sight of her parents' killer brought back a flood of memories she'd spent months trying to suppress her father's shocked expression as the bullet hit her mother's scream, cut short by a second shot, and the cold satisfaction in Kane's eyes as he'd ordered Dutch to leave her for dead. "Stay calm," Rourke cautioned quietly, though she could see tension in his own shoulders. "Remember, we wait for Broder. We need both of them present if we're going to expose the full extent of their conspiracy." They didn't wait long. Elias Broder entered the Copper King like a man who owned not just the establishment, but the entire town surrounding it. He was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair perfectly groomed and expensive Eastern clothes that marked him as someone who transcended frontier roughness to achieve genuine wealth and political influence. But it was when Broder removed his hat and hung it on a wall peg that Eliza's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She could see his profile clearly now, and with it came a flood of childhood memories that had been buried under trauma and time, but never truly forgotten. The distinctive scar running from his left temple to his jaw, a mark so characteristic it could belong to no one else. The pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw, evaluating people and property. With the cold calculation of a man who saw the world as a series of assets to be acquired or obstacles to be eliminated. The way he moved with predatory patience, like a wolf studying a flock of sheep while deciding which one to take first. "Rourke," she whispered urgently, gripping his arm with desperate intensity. "Broder isn't just Kane's partner. He used to visit our ranch when I was young, calling himself Eli Brooker. My father trusted him completely, shared information about our property and mineral surveys, welcomed him into our home as a friend and advisor." The deputy's expression sharpened with understanding that made the lamplight seem brighter, and the conversations around them more meaningful. "He was gathering intelligence, mapping your father's property for future theft. This conspiracy goes back years, not months. Broder was accompanied by 2 well-dressed associates and made his way directly to the high-stakes poker table where several other prosperous-looking men were waiting with stacks of silver coins and territorial currency. The game that was about to begin represented more than entertainment. It was a gathering of the most powerful men in the region. A council where decisions were made that would affect thousands of lives and millions of dollars in mining operations. Kane and his gang positioned themselves at the bar, close enough to provide security while maintaining the pretense of casual drinking. But as Eliza watched more carefully, she began to notice things that made her skin crawl with apprehension and growing dread. Several of the miners and merchants, scattered throughout the saloon, kept glancing toward Broder and Kane as if awaiting signals, their postures too alert and their attention too focused to be genuine customers enjoying an evening of gambling and drinking. The bartender had positioned himself where he could see the entire room, and his hand never strayed far from something hidden beneath the bar, probably a shotgun or rifle kept ready for trouble. Most unsettling of all, underlying the usual saloon smells of tobacco smoke and whiskey, she caught the distinctive scent of cheap gunpowder mixed with gun oil, not the kind of smell that clung to men who made their living with weapons and bought ammunition in bulk rather than a few cartridges at a time. "Too many people are watching without drinking," she murmured to Quanah, trusting his warrior's instincts to confirm what her other senses were telling her. The warrior nodded almost imperceptibly, his own eyes scanning the room with professional assessment. 8 men minimum who aren't here for gambling. This smells like a trap that's been carefully planned. But before they could reconsider their strategy or find an alternative approach, Rourke was already standing and walking across the room toward the poker table. The plan was in motion, and there was no way to stop it without creating the kind of scene that would alert every enemy in the building to their presence and intentions. Now what? Eliza asked, feeling her heart rate accelerate as the moment of confrontation approached with the inevitability of an avalanche. Now we spring our trap. Quanah replied grimly, though his tone carried more resignation than confidence. And hope we live long enough to see justice done. Rourke approached Broder's table with casual confidence. But Eliza could see tension in his shoulders that suggested he sensed the same wrongness she'd noticed in the room's atmosphere. He leaned down to whisper something in the mine owner's ear, and Broder's reaction wasn't what any of them had expected or prepared for. Instead of surprise or alarm at being confronted with evidence of his crimes, Broder's scarred face split into a smile of cold satisfaction that suggested he'd been expecting this moment and had prepared accordingly. He looked up at Rourke with the expression of a man who'd laid a trap and was pleased to see his prey walking into it exactly as planned. "Gentlemen," Broder announced loudly enough to be heard throughout the saloon, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention and obedience. "It appears we have unexpected guests. Deputy Rourke has brought us the allegedly dead Eliza Caraway, who's apparently decided to come home after her extended vacation in the desert." Every conversation stopped as if cut by a knife. Every face turned toward their corner table with fascinated attention that felt like being examined by a jury that had already decided on a verdict of guilt. Kane's predatory smile widened as he stepped away from the bar, with his hand resting on his gun butt while his men shifted position to control key exit routes. The trap had been sprung, but not in the way they'd planned or anticipated. Somehow Broder had been expecting them, had prepared for this confrontation with the same meticulous planning he'd used to steal her family's ranch and cover up the murders that had made it possible. "Miss Caraway," Broder continued with mock courtesy that dripped poison, "how delightful to see you've survived your desert wanderings. Though I fear your ordeal has affected your mind more than your eyesight, leading you to construct elaborate fantasies to explain natural tragedies." Eliza rose to her feet, realizing that their carefully planned ambush had become a desperate battle for survival. But she'd come too far and sacrificed too much to back down now, regardless of the odds stacked against them or the certainty that Kane's men outnumbered them at least 3-1. "My name is Eliza Caraway." She called out, her voice clear and strong despite the fear clawing at her throat. 6 months ago, Virgil Kane murdered my parents and stole our land deed on the direct orders of Elias Broder, the man you knew as Eli Brooker, when he visited our ranch to plan his theft. Fascinating delusion. Broder replied smoothly, standing from the poker table with theatrical grace that suggested he'd rehearsed this performance. "Gentlemen, you're witnessing the tragic spectacle of a woman driven mad by grief and months of hardship. She's been wandering the territory, constructing elaborate fantasies to explain her family's death from fever." But Rourke had reached the poker table and was spreading the mining documents for other players to examine, his voice carrying the authority of legal training and honest conviction. "These federal permits tell a different story," he announced with determination that cut through Broder's theatrical dismissals. "Legal documents proving Thomas Caraway owned mineral rights that were stolen through fraud and murder." The effect was electric, but not in the way they'd hoped or expected. Instead of shocked gasps and demands for justice, several of the miners and gamblers around the room began reaching for concealed weapons with practiced efficiency that spoke of military training or professional experience with violence. Among them, Eliza noticed a young man who hesitated, his face showing fear and uncertainty before he reluctantly drew his gun with obvious reluctance. His eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape route. And she realized that not all of Broder's men were willing participants in what was about to happen. Some were driven by desperation or coercion rather than greed or loyalty. Near the bar, she spotted two shopkeepers she recognized from their earlier walk through town. Men who'd avoided eye contact when Rourke had tried to gather support for confronting the corruption that plagued Copper Junction. Their faces showed the internal conflict between fear of Broder's retribution and disgust at what they were witnessing, the struggle between self-preservation and moral obligation that defined life in a place where justice was for sale. Broder's trap was springing with deadly precision, revealing the extent of his control over the town and the people in it. But it also revealed the cracks in that control, the reluctant allies and fearful supporters who might turn against him if given sufficient motivation or opportunity. I'm afraid Deputy Rourke has been deceived by clever forgeries, Broder announced with theatrical regret that convinced no one who looked closely at his cold eyes. Just as Miss Carroway has been deceived by her own damaged mind and desperate need to blame someone for natural tragedy. Kane drew his gun with practiced speed, the weapon appearing in his hand, like magic conjured from years of violent experience. But Quanah was already moving with the fluid grace that marked him as a warrior, trained from childhood in the arts of survival and combat. The Comanche warrior's knife flew across the crowded room like a striking falcon, its blade catching lamplight as it spun end over end with deadly precision. The weapon took one of Kane's men in the throat before the outlaw could clear leather, sending him crashing backward into a table laden with glasses and bottles. But there were too many enemies, and they'd been expecting violence from the moment Eliza and her companions had entered the building. Gunfire erupted throughout the saloon. As Broder's hidden allies revealed themselves, muzzle flashes lighting the room like lightning, while the thunder of multiple weapons firing created a cacophony that drowned out screams and shouts. As bullets began flying and genuine customers dove for cover behind overturned tables and bar fixtures, Eliza grabbed the oil lamp from their table and hurled it against the wall behind the bar with all her strength. The glass shattered on impact, sending burning oil spreading across the wooden surface and spilled alcohol that ignited instantly. Flames spread with frightening speed, and within seconds, the saloon was filled with choking smoke that transformed their numerical disadvantage into an opportunity for survival. In the sudden darkness and confusion that followed, her enhanced hearing proved invaluable in ways that surprised even her. She could distinguish between the sharp crack of rifle fire and the duller boom of pistols between the heavy boots of professional killers moving through the chaos and the lighter steps of fleeing customers trying to reach exits. The months of adaptation to her damaged vision were revealing themselves as unexpected advantages in circumstances she could never have anticipated. "The kitchen," she shouted to Quanah, guiding him through the maze of overturned furniture toward the rear exit, while bullets whined overhead and men cursed in multiple languages. "And when we get there, remember what I told you about Broder's escape routes, the fireplace." Her childhood memory of Brooker's drunken boasting about hidden passages had become their potential salvation. As they fought their way through the chaos, dodging falling debris from the spreading fire, and stumbling over wounded men sprawled on the blood-slicked floor, she could hear Kane cursing as he pursued them with single-minded determination. The kitchen offered tactical advantages for someone who knew how to use them, and had the desperate creativity that comes from fighting for survival against overwhelming odds. Eliza swept cooking knives from a preparation table, scattering them across the floor, where Kane's boots would find them when he came charging through the doorway in pursuit. The outlaw slipped on the scattered blades exactly as she'd hoped, his feet going out from under him and sending him crashing into a cast-iron stove with enough force to rattle every pot and pan in the room. But he was tougher than she'd expected, rolling with the impact and coming up with his backup pistol already in his hand. Meanwhile, Rourke was fighting his own desperate battle with Broder near the front of the building, and their struggle complicated by the spreading fire and the genuine customers who were fleeing in panic. The mine owner had produced a derringer from his vest, but the deputy was younger, more desperate, and fighting for something more important than money or power. But as the mine owner tried to retreat toward his prepared escape route behind the main fireplace, Eliza's shouted warning about the hidden passage allowed Rourke to anticipate his movement and intercept him before he could disappear into whatever bolt hole he'd prepared for emergencies. "The fireplace," she shouted again, her voice carrying over the gunfire and screaming. "He has a hidden passage behind the fireplace." The street battle that followed was unlike anything Copper Junction had ever seen. A chaotic melee that involved not just the original conspirators, but half the town's population, as long-suppressed grievances and loyalties finally exploded into open conflict. The shopkeepers who'd initially cowered in fear now emerged from their stores with hunting rifles and shotguns, joining miners who'd lost friends to claim jumpers and corrupt officials in a spontaneous uprising against the corruption that had plagued their community. The young gunman who'd hesitated in the saloon threw down his weapon entirely and ran rather than continue fighting for a cause he didn't believe in his defection, encouraging others to reconsider their loyalties. In the burning kitchen, Kane made his final stand against Quanah in a vicious hand-to-hand struggle that ranged from the preparation area to the storage room and back again. Both men were wounded, bleeding, and exhausted, but neither was willing to quit while his enemy still drew breath. The fight was brutal and personal, involving knives, improvised weapons, and bare hands in a contest that had nothing to do with skill or training and everything to do with pure determination to survive. When Kane's pistol finally discharged in the final moments of their struggle, it was the outlaw who crumpled to the blood-soaked floor with surprise frozen on his scarred features. "Is it over?" Eliza asked, helping Quanah to his feet while smoke billowed around them from the spreading fire. "Not yet," he replied grimly, though his tone carried satisfaction rather than despair. "But we're winning." When they emerged from the burning building into the street, they found that the battle had indeed turned decisively in favor of justice over corruption. Rourke had managed to corner Broder with help from townspeople who'd finally found their courage, while the hired guns were either dead wounded or fleeing toward the hills rather than face the wrath of a community that had finally reached its breaking point. Bodies lay scattered in the street, some belonging to Broder's men and others to innocent bystanders who'd been caught in the crossfire. The Copper King saloon burned behind them, its flames lighting the night sky and serving as a beacon visible for miles in every direction, a signal that the old order was ending and something new was beginning to take its place. "It's finished," Rourke called to them, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, but his grip firm on Broder's arm as he forced the mine owner to his knees in the muddy street. "We have enough evidence to hang half the territorial government and witnesses who'll testify to everything they've seen tonight." As the smoke cleared and the immediate danger passed, Eliza found herself standing in the middle of Copper Junction's main street, surrounded by the wreckage of the conspiracy that had destroyed her family, but also by the hope of justice finally being served. Kane lay dead in the ruins of the saloon, while Broder knelt in the dirt with his hands bound behind his back, the arrogance finally gone from his scarred features. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back her parents or restore the innocence she'd lost that terrible morning 6 months ago. What it could do was provide closure, the knowledge that those responsible for so much pain and suffering had finally been held accountable for their crimes. The aftermath of the battle in Copper Junction lasted 3 days, during which federal marshals arrived from Denver to sort through the evidence and arrest the surviving conspirators. Broder's confession, extracted in exchange for life imprisonment instead of hanging, revealed the full scope of a land fraud scheme that reached into territorial government and involved dozens of corrupt officials at every level. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of corruption that had been operating for years, stealing land from honest settlers and selling it to Eastern investors who had no idea their profits were built on murder and theft. Dozens of cases were reopened, property was returned to rightful owners, and several territorial officials were removed from office in disgrace. For Eliza, the most important moment came when she stood beside Kane's grave in the town cemetery, finally able to speak the words she'd carried in her heart for months while his crimes had gone unpunished. "It's finished," she said simply, her voice carrying across the quiet graveyard where so many frontier dreams lay buried. You can rest now, knowing that justice was finally done. Quanah stood beside her in respectful silence, understanding that some ceremonies required no words from outsiders, no attempts at comfort or explanation. When she was ready, they walked back toward their future together, leaving the past buried where it belonged. "What will you do now?" he asked, as they passed through streets that were slowly returning to normal after the chaos of the previous nights. "Let's go home," she replied without hesitation, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd finally found her way. "Back to the ranch, back to the river where I grew up. There's work to be done there, a life to rebuild from what's left of what my parents created." "And what about me? Where do I fit in your plans for the future?" She stopped walking and turned to face him, directly studying his weathered features in the afternoon sunlight that no longer caused her the blinding pain she'd experienced for so many months. "That depends on what you want, Quanah. You've fulfilled your obligation to your brother. Cain is dead, and the war pony has been returned to your people. You're free to go wherever the trails lead you, and if I choose to stay, if I want to help you rebuild what was stolen." The question hung between them like smoke from dying fires, carrying implications that went far beyond simple partnership or business arrangements. They'd been through too much together for anything to be simple anymore, had shared dangers and triumphs that created bonds deeper than mere friendship or gratitude. "Then we build something new together," she said finally, her words carrying the weight of a promise and a hope. "Not just my family's ranch, but something that belongs to both of us. Something that honors what we've lost while creating what we hope to become." 3 weeks later, they stood together on the porch of her childhood home, watching the sun set over the Arkansas River Valley, where cottonwoods whispered ancient secrets to the flowing water. The ranch buildings showed months of neglect and would need extensive repairs before becoming fully functional again. But the foundation was solid, and the land was rich with possibilities. They'd spent the day working side by side, mending fences with wood cut from their own timber cleaning stables that would soon house the finest horses in Colorado territory, replanting fields that had gone fallow during her absence, but would soon bloom again with crops that would feed both livestock and family. It was hard work that left them both exhausted, but it was the kind of tiredness that came from building rather than destroying, from creating something meaningful rather than simply surviving from one day to the next. Every board they nailed, every post they set, every seed they planted was a declaration that the future held more promise than the past had held pain. Quanah's brother's war pony grazed peacefully in the pasture with several other horses they'd purchased from local ranchers who respected their plans and approved of their goals. The stallion was everything Quanah had claimed, intelligent, spirited, and possessed of the indefinable quality that made certain animals legendary among those who understood horses. "He's beautiful," Eliza said, watching the horse move with fluid grace across the grass where her father had once grazed cattle. "I can see why your brother loved him so much. Tachi used to say that the best horses choose their riders, not the other way around." Quanah replied, his voice carrying warmth and sadness in equal measure. "That stallion has been waiting for someone worthy to earn his trust again." The carved spirit horse that had belonged to Tachi now sat on their mantelpiece inside the house, no longer a symbol of unfinished business, but a reminder of connections that transcended death itself. Beside it, Eliza had placed her grandmother's silver locket, two family treasures that represented the past they honored and the future they would build together. As darkness settled over the valley and the first stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky, they sat in comfortable silence on the porch swing her father had built for her mother all those years ago. The sound of running water over stones provided a peaceful counterpoint to their thoughts, while night birds called to each other across distances that seemed infinite under the starlight. "Do you ever regret leaving the old ways behind?" Eliza asked eventually, breaking the comfortable silence with a question that had been on her mind for days. I haven't left them behind, Quanah replied, taking her hand in his with a gentleness that contrasted with the calluses earned through years of hard living. I've carried them forward into something new. The old ways taught me about honor, courage, and respect for all living things. Those lessons live on in everything we do together. His words carried the wisdom of someone who'd learned that tradition wasn't about refusing to change, but about carrying the best of the past into whatever future circumstances demanded. The skills that had made him a successful warrior were the same skills that would make him a successful rancher. Patience, observation, and the ability to work with rather than against the natural world. And do you think we can make this work? Two people from different worlds trying to build something that honors both traditions. Look around you, he said, gesturing toward the restored buildings and peaceful pastures that represented their shared vision made manifest. We've already begun. The question isn't whether we can make it work, but whether we're brave enough to keep building despite whatever obstacles the future brings. She squeezed his hand, gently feeling the strength and steadiness that had carried her through the darkest period of her life and brought her safely to this moment of hope and possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, horses to train, business to conduct, a future to construct from hope and determination, and the lessons they'd learned about survival and justice. But tonight, it was enough to sit beside the Arkansas River where she'd grown up to know that her parents' killers had faced justice and could never hurt anyone else, and to have found love in circumstances that might have destroyed lesser spirits. Behind them, lamplight glowed warm and welcoming in the windows of the house they would share, while ahead of them stretched years of partnership based on trust, respect, and the quiet determination to create something meaningful from what they'd almost lost forever. In the distance, a night bird called across the water with a song that sounded like contentment itself. And somewhere among the horses in the pasture, Tachi's war pony lifted his head, as if hearing the voice of his long-dead master, finally telling him that all was well, and it was time to rest. Their love story would become legend in Colorado territory. Proof that two people from different worlds could find each other in the darkest circumstances and create something beautiful together. It would be told around campfires and family gatherings for generations to come, a story about courage in the face of overwhelming odds, about justice delayed but not denied, and about the power of human connection to transform tragedy into triumph. But on this quiet evening beside the river, with stars beginning to shine in the vast sky above them, they were simply two survivors who'd chosen hope over despair, love over hatred, and the courage to build new dreams from the ashes of the old. It was more than enough to justify everything they'd endured to reach this moment. It was everything.